I'm Jenna,
Francesca,
Devin,
Marcella,
Carter,
and Jackson.
And today we will be discussing the story El Hijo by Horacio Quiroga from Uruguay.
So in this story, a father allows his young son to go into the woods hunting one morning. The boy leaves at 9, and the father tells him to be back at noon, to which the son agrees. The father then continues to go about his day reflecting on his decision. His son is his entire life, but he trusts that he will be fine and is completely at ease. At 10 a.m., he hears a gunshot and assumes that his son has shot something. At noon, however, his son has not returned, and he is sure that his son would listen to his instructions. Finally, it is 12:30, and the father leaves to look for his son, growing more and more worried. He does not want to yell at his son's name, because to him that would be announcing the boy's death. He eventually meets up with his son and begins walking back to the house with him, relieved. However, this is just a hallucination, because the father actually finds his son dead, tangled up in barbed wire, and ultimately walks back to the house alone.
So we found a video adaptation of this story on YouTube directed by Fernanda Maldonado, and the link will be in our podcast. And so this adaptation opens with a scene of the son being sent off to go hunt by his father, and it seems like his father is comfortable with his son going off on his own. And then we see his father smoking multiple cigarettes and drinking multiple drinks and waiting for his son's return. In this time, he also cleans his own rifle, and we see him waiting further with the clock ticking in the background the entire time. He's getting increasingly uneasy and during this wait, and then he eventually decides to go looking for his son, and we see him running through a field and running through the woods, and eventually calling out his son's name, trying to get his son to respond. He runs into his son, and the images start to get a little muddled between his son walking back with his gun and him holding the gun, and then the scene ends with him crying alone, and we become aware that he never walked back with his son at all. He found his son dead, and he's alone at the end of the story. Why do you think the director and the movie took that route as opposed to the promising setting of the story in the literary version?
Well, I think the darkness kind of represents the darkness in the author's life. Horacio Quiroga was born in 1878, and a few months after he was born, his father actually shot himself during a hunting trip, much like the son does in the story. So he kind of draws from his personal life, and I think the video is trying to show that much more than the story. And in one point in his life, Horacio Quiroga was actually cleaning a gun, and the gun backfired and accidentally shot his friend, and he had to be cleared by the police for this death. And so in the movie, we see the father cleaning the gun, and I believe that represents the author and how his personal tragedies are the basis for the story.
So, would you say that the movie gives a broader vision of the entire life of the author, whereas the story, since it's written by the author, it's merely fiction that has to relate to his experience with losing his father?
I believe that the story is much more narrow-minded to think of a specific time in the author's life, just losing his father or losing his friend. But I think the movie's trying to show all the tragedies that happened in the author's life, because after his father died, his mother remarried, and his stepfather committed suicide. And then after that, Quiroga was actually rejected by multiple girls. He finally got married, and his wife committed suicide, and he killed his friend, and then he ended up committing suicide in 1937 when he was diagnosed with prostate cancer. So I think it's giving, the setting of the movie is giving more of a sense of doom, showing like how awful the author's life was.
I also think that plays into the significance of no mother in the story.
So do you think that nature represents the mother in the story, since, like Devin said, we don't see a mother?
I definitely think so. At least in the written version of the story, the woods are a really fun place to be. It's an exciting afternoon, an exciting morning for the child to go out into the woods.
Going off of that, originally when the boy goes into the woods, you would think that the father would be nervous about this, especially because the son's going into the woods with a shotgun, but the father is oddly at ease, and he doesn't really know why himself, but he feels sure of the future. And women or mothers tend to have this role of nurturing or having a caring role, so the woods could act as a nurturing element, which would have the father at ease.
I also find it interesting how he falls when he dies. The son falls when he passes away, and so he's kind of falling into Mother Nature because he's in the woods, so he's falling back into his mother. We're really unclear about whether his mother passed away or whether she just left. But if she did pass away, he's kind of falling back into her, falling into nature and into his mother.
So in the story, the son doesn't have a name. He's just known as El Hijo, and during certain parts, the father refers to the son as Chiquito Mío, or in English, my boy. So what do you think is the significance of him not having a name in the story? That question, I personally thought that the son didn't have a name because when we're talking about trauma in Death and the Maiden, we were talking about how there is no specific country or community. So in this story, the son doesn't have a name, so it kind of brings you closer to the trauma because anyone could be in that position. It could be anyone's son that's getting killed. And so by giving him a name, like they do in the movie, you're kind of taking a step back and being like, oh, well, it can't be my son because my son had a different name. So it's kind of putting you directly in the drama.
Kind of to build off of the trauma aspect, he doesn't yell. The author builds it up in saying that if he were to yell out, my son, it would almost be an aspect of how the father is accepting that his son, without responding, is dead. So what do you guys think, what significance is there to not revealing the fate of the boy until the very, very end?
I think it creates some sort of suspense. You don't really know if the father's hallucinations are real or if he's kind of unstable mentally in that time, because there's a lot of foreshadowing to the son's death, but you're not really sure for certain till the end. In the story, it says, at 13 years, he, the father, would have given his life to possess a shotgun. His son, at that age, possesses one now, and the father smiles. So at times, there's foreshadowing to his death, but the hallucinations create some kind of mystery around the son's death. You don't know what to believe, and I think that's what he wants to portray.
Yeah, I think it kind of creates like a climax whenever he actually finds the son, but it's his hallucination. I think it's a good way to bring the hallucinations into it, playing into his actual life.
Horacio Quiroga states that it is so easy for a small child to miscalculate, set a foot into emptiness, and result in the loss of a son, which kind of foreshadows like what we don't know but will later happen with his son's death.
So Jackson, what elements of both the plot and the story are enhanced and more easily or less easily recognizable in the film versus the text?
Well, what I think is less recognizable is the fact that, or is the idea in the story that the son in the end will die. in the story, at one point, he talks about how his hallucination comes back to him as he's doing his daily task, whatever that was. And we don't exactly know if he's crazy, if he's somewhat a psychic in that regard, that he'll be accurate. But in the film, he, at the one point when he's sitting in the living room and you can hear all of the things that enhance the idea that time is passing, the cigarettes are burning, the ice is melting in his glass, and the only sound we hear besides the father's panting and like nervous reactions is the sound of the clock ticking, which then symbolizes literally and figuratively time passing. And in that scene, in the film we see that you can't determine whether it's an hallucination or not, but the father holds a rifle, and completely juxtaposed with that is the shot of the son in the woods also holding a rifle, clearly pointing it at something. But as they shoot it simultaneously at the time they shoot it, however, the father puts his gun down and the son falls to the ground. And you're not exactly sure what happens, but you can tell that it's hard to in the film realize that is a hallucination or not. But rather you think at the time that due to all the clues it put together next to each other, that it could be realistic rather than just hallucination as opposed to the story.
So in both the film and the text, we know that the father's mental state is altered in some way, but do you guys feel that it's more clear when we can read his thoughts in the text and read his confusion, or is it more clear when we can see him consuming so much alcohol and know that he's intoxicated in some way?
In the text, it talks about his hallucinations, so we know that his mental state is altered. But in the film, when it shows like how he drank alcohol continuously and was continuously smoking, we realize that his mental state is much more than just the hallucinations.
Jackson, what components do the filmmakers use to enhance the differences between the text and the movie? And do you think these differences are successful?
Kind of like I previously mentioned with the time elapse, in the story, the father's somewhat occupied with doing his chore, and he keeps looking up to see the sun, which to him then shows that time is passing, and he gets worried. He gets more and more worried as the sun gets farther and farther past the highest point in the sky. And to kind of show that in the story, they don't use the sun because the entire time they just elude from using that element of sun in order to use like the dark, overcast, dusk element. But what they do use is the time passing of the sound in the background. The only sound we hear is the ticking clock. The only thing we see at one point is a close-up of a cigarette burning. And while the father is preoccupied sitting in the living room thinking about things, typically one smokes or drinks, we'll focus on smokes to do it while thinking about something else, kind of reflect on a day, think about something in the future. But the entire time he's so worried that the cigarette sits in the ashtray and just burns away, showing that a long time has elapsed.
Do you think that nature is a third character in this film and the literary text?
Yeah, wilderness definitely acts as a third character in the story. It sort of acts as an antagonist. Quiroga shows how nature is beautiful in many elements, yet he personifies it by showing how nature can have a dark side as well. As we previously talked about, nature does begin to act like a mother figure to the father's child.
So I also think that the nature elements are very beautiful in the story, like the blue skies, the warmth. But when it switches to wilderness, it has much more, like the characteristics become much more dark. So.
Yeah, and I think to add on to that, wilderness, the words themselves, nature has a connotation of beautiful, like natural.
Sounds almost like nurture.
Exactly, yeah. And wilderness, wild. It's the unknown. It's the land. It's that we don't know what we're getting into, even if we are prepared. I think it's kind of cool how the author talks about to foreshadow that maybe the son's going into a wild nature that could turn into wild that he's not prepared for. He talks about he's worried about the weakness in his son's strengths, to quote it directly. And before that, he talks about how the shotgun is it makes him feel safe. It makes the father feel safe about his son. But despite that fact, he is worried about the strength of the shotgun, the weakness of the son with that strength, and his ability to use it or disability in using it as it turns out.
As we previously mentioned, the author had a pretty traumatic lifestyle. So do you think by writing this piece, which clearly reflects his life, do you think it was sort of a therapeutic activity for him or a therapeutic way to show his feelings?
I definitely think it was. The author went through a lot of death in his life, and the death of his father is extremely influential on this story. The son is 13 years old, and I think that although the son is the one who dies in this story, because the author wrote it as an adult, he can only remember in context of his life now. And so it's still the death within a father-son relationship that occurs, even though it isn't actually the death of the father.
Mm-hmm. I also want to talk about how the author put in his opinion on guns. He shows guns as a way for hunting and survival. It's a way to get food, way to eat. And in the story, he also has a negative view on guns because you can see how guns cause the loss of life of loved ones. So just as they can provide for your family and keep your family alive, they can just as easily take away your life, which also talks about how nature gives and takes. So nature provides food, but it also can kill you.
To build off what Jenna said, the circle of life is a central theme in this text. Despite its beauty, inevitably nature takes away its gift of life. Unfortunately, even nature can be wild at times, and wilderness can shorten the beauty that nature brings itself. But this is the price that some pay. It directly leads into the circle of life, and for the son, it was no different, however traumatic it was.
That wraps up our podcast. If you want to follow a link to either the text or the video, there are links below in the description. You can look at those, look at the text for yourself, and then you leave comments below. We would love feedback. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks again.